Hello everyone, and welcome to the lecture on errors and exceptions handling. In this lecture, we'll define what errors are and we'll see most kinds of errors. Let's start by our discussion on errors. Errors are usually mistakes made by the programmer. So whoever is coding will be making those errors, and we call those bugs. So we refer to errors as bugs. And usually these errors are due to the programmer. Okay? Whoever is writing the codes will most likely be creating these errors. And errors are divided into 3 categories. So most of the errors could be either syntax errors or runtime errors or logical errors. Usually errors fall under these 3 categories. Let's start by looking at syntax errors. So those are one common kind of errors, and those errors are like not defining a keyword, for instance. That would fall under a syntax error. And if you are using or putting an incorrect indentation, you'll get those syntax errors. And if you misspelled a word or use a parenthesis instead of a colon or something like that, that will give you a syntax error. Let's see some examples of syntax errors. Let's see an example. Print hi there, and then forget the closing quote and run it. I get a syntax error, right? That's one example of syntax error. Another example could be, let's say, if x is equal to 0, and then let's say print hello, run it, you'll get a syntax error. That's because you missed a colon here, right? Or if you simply use, let's say, if we say else print not correct, if you run it, you'll get a syntax error, because in this case you need an if statement for your else statement. Let's say you define a function without the def keyword, and if we say, let's say, function name, then pass a parameter, let's say, let's pass 3 parameters, ABC, and return A plus B minus C. So if you run that, you'll get a syntax error because you are missing the def keyword when you defined your function. So these are some examples of syntax errors. Next, let's see some runtime errors. Runtime errors. Runtime errors will not have any kind of syntax errors. So your syntax could be correct in this case. However, you will run into this runtime errors. For instance, if you are trying to divide a number by 0, or if you try to use a variable that you haven't defined, or if you try to open a file which doesn't exist, you will run into this runtime errors. For instance, if you say 5 divided by 0, this is a runtime error. there is nothing wrong with this expression, right? You are trying to divide one number by another, but the problem is that division by 0 is not allowed, so you run into that error. And another example of runtime error is if you are trying to open a file that doesn't exist, you'll run into a runtime error. The last category of errors is logical errors. So logical error is a little bit different than the other two categories. That's because these logical errors are a bit harder to find a solution or fix them. That's because it deals with logic. For instance, let's say if you are using an if statement, let's say x is equal to 0, and then let's use an if statement. You can say if x is equal to 5, you can print some statement here, and then while x, and if x double equal to 5, you can check some other conditions. For instance, you can say if x is, you can have some conditions here, and then you can have another if with an if. So in case, let's say you have a nested if statement, and you could have one of the nested ifs in the wrong indentation. Okay, you could indent one of these if blocks to the wrong levels, and that will run into a logical error. Even if you have even if your program is correct in its syntax, you could run into some wrong indentations, and that will create problem with the logic of your program, and that will be a logical error, and it's a bit harder to fix compared to the other kinds of errors because you are dealing with logic. Another example of logical error is, let's say you try to add some numbers. Let's say 4 plus 5 minus 7 plus 2 divided by 4 times 6 times 5 minus 3. So if you have statements like this, and if you are not sure of the order of precedence for these operations, you will run into logical errors. For instance, if you expect this operation to be performed from the beginning to the end, let's say if you are expecting this to be 4 plus 5, 9, 9 minus 7, 2, 2 plus 2 is 4, 4 divided by 4 is 1, 1 times 5, 1 times 5 is 5, 5 minus 3 is 2. So if you expect this operation to result 2, and when you run this, you get -1. So that's a logical error. It's different from your expectation, right? That's because you are not quite sure of the order of operation precedence. So that falls under logical errors. That's why it makes it hard to fix those logical errors. So the errors or exceptions that we encounter while programming fall under these three categories: syntax, runtime, or logical errors. This is the broad category. But you will be seeing a lot of errors. For instance, so far we have seen syntax errors, we have run across key errors, indentation errors, you might run into that. But you'll see so many other kinds of errors or exceptions. For instance, IO error, syntax error, system exit error, index errors, zero division errors, end of file error, import error, and so on. But whatever error you see, they fall into one of the three categories in general. Okay, this is also a general introduction into errors and exceptions in Python. And in the next lecture, we'll see how to handle these errors or exceptions. We'll see how we can handle them by including statements like try and except. Thank you everyone, and see you at the next lecture.